some of you have already touched on some of the things I was going to bring up in a good way. We can add to the conversation. I was going to kind of provide a little bit of the larger term, so what context that kind of comes with my realm in history, and taking a step back and start with the whole doping scandals that have, whether you decide to call them reemerge or have resurfaced, they've always been there perhaps. Certainly this week's disclosures about the medical records of certain American athletes, but also really kind of delving into the issue of the Russian state-sponsored doping programs that were brought to light earlier this year through accounts given to the New York Times and WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency's McLaren report, confirming that. And doping has always been a part of the modern sports world and of the modern Olympics. The modern Olympics were really created in their essence in 1896. The first documented case of doping at the Olympics was in 1904 with an American runner who was given some combination of egg white, strychnine, and brandy by his doctor in order to get him hopped up enough to finish the race. So whether we like it or not, doping has always been a part of the modern games, whether it's the Olympics, professional sport, World Cup, other major international tournaments. And I think one of the questions that arises is why? Certainly there's this reason of trying to excel and perform to be number one. But also when you have certain actors, whether they be state actors or other entities that go along with such programs or turn a blind eye to such programs, we always get into this question of the pride of winning. And I think that's one of the themes that kind of comes out when we talk about scandal in the Olympics or scandal in the modern sports world, whether they be larger tournaments or even within the professional leagues. Why does one want to win, particularly in national competitions such as the Olympics? Supposedly we're in a post-national world, or at least that's what many of the pundits tell us. I would suggest maybe we're not quite there yet. And one of the questions that I hope we'll get into a little bit is, are we in a new Cold War of sports? Or did the original Cold War of sports that typified competitions from the Soviet Union's entry in 1952 through the early 1990s, did that ever in fact really stop? What does a country get out of winning or putting its best foot forward? Well, certainly there's a lot in terms of legitimacy. To host a major international tournament, such as the Olympics or the World Cup, the Basketball World Championship, or other events, it confers to many that you've arrived, that you have the infrastructure, that you have the money, that you have the support, the popularity to pull off such an event. It's also in many ways a form of nation branding, to put your best face forward to the nation. We certainly think about this a lot today, and how Rio really tried to pull out all the stops to give the world a show, despite the quite severe political, economic context in which they occurred. But certainly this has been going on for quite a while, going back to decades. The Berlin Games, the Nazi Olympics, as they're often referred to, the same exact thing, using a major tournament as kind of a cosmetic facelift to put your best face forward to the world. So it confers legitimacy, it confers certain elements of perhaps glory, that you are able to produce and sustain and train such athletes, that they represent the nation and the ideals that national identities or senses of exceptionalism try to convey. That's certainly a part of it. And what we saw emerging starting in the 1950s onwards was a space for nations that were not the superpowers of the world to use the sports terrain as ways to flex their muscle, almost literally, in ways that they might not be able to in other aspects of the international world. And one thinks often of the Cold War, the battles between Washington and Moscow over policy, over the hearts and minds of publics in the world, particularly in the decolonizing global South. One thinks of the Cold War of athletics and the medal fights between the Soviet Union and the United States. There was also Cold War battles within the Eastern Bloc, and of how East Germany used the Olympics or other sports venues to try to assert independence and perhaps at times a degree of so-theirs to the Soviet Union. So there is that context of it as well. But certainly other countries use the sports terrain to assert themselves, to say, well, we might not be number one or number two. We might not have the same ability to influence global military policy, international development in quite the same way. But we do have the ability to try to influence others around the world through producing athletes who win. Maybe not always gold medals, but certainly on the medal table. And so when I've done a lot of my work on the history of sport, and particularly in the French case, it was exactly this, this little niche that many countries that were not the Soviet Union, that were not the United States, that were not East Germany, really sought to fill. Sports was an arena in which they could win, could gain some degrees of influence, and perhaps try to influence how other countries adapted their sports programs or looked to them for cultural cues and innovations. So there is certainly this idea of sport as a venue for many different ideas and topics. One of the interesting things that has come out of my work on French sport, as Josh mentioned, is this idea that it's not just one thing to win, but it's another thing to choose your battles. The French government archives for the Ministry of Youth and Sports very clearly detail that they recognized they could never really come in number 1, 2, or 3 in the Olympic medal tables. They just didn't have the population, the financial resources, or the wherewithal to do so. But what they did was look at what sports they thought they could excel at, where they thought they did produce winning athletes already. The sports that they felt were best suited to their national psyche. And there are reports within the archives that say the most cerebral sports are those that are best suited to the French psyche, because we are one of the more cerebral cultures around. The most cerebral sport is fencing for individual sports, and basketball for team sports. Therefore, we should put a lot of resources and funding into ensuring that our fencers and our basketball players will win, because through them we can show valor on the world stage. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the essence that you get away from, that you take away from some of these documents. They picked and chose exactly where they decided to invest. As time goes forward, one of the questions that I ask myself, and that I'd like to ask the panel as well, is to what extent are the Olympics still the #1 most prized sports competition? Or has the FIFA World Cup, the Men's Cup, perhaps started to overtake the Olympics in terms of, well, many different categories under the sun? Unfortunately, I think we're still quite a ways away from the Women's World Cup really reaching that rung, but it certainly has made significant strides in the past few editions.